I'm going to tell you a story that is difficult to hear, not because of how it ended, but because every new piece of evidence seems to push investigators further away from the possibility of an accident and closer to the picture of a carefully hidden crime. For months, many of the details surrounding 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez remained hidden from the public. Then the preliminary hearing began. Inside a Los Angeles courtroom, prosecutors slowly laid out photographs, forensic findings, digital evidence, and witness testimony that had never been heard before. By the end of the hearing, investigators believed they had assembled a timeline that stretched back years, a timeline that did not begin with a murder. It began with a relationship. And according to prosecutors, that relationship started when Celeste was only 11 years old. Today, we are going to examine how investigators say they built their case against David Burke, not by relying on a single witness, not through a confession, but by connecting dozens of individual pieces of evidence into one larger picture. As with every criminal case, it is important to remember that David Burke has pleaded not guilty, and the allegations presented by prosecutors have not yet been tested before a jury. The preliminary hearing was not about deciding guilt. Its purpose was to determine whether prosecutors had enough evidence for the case to move forward. What happened inside that courtroom may become the foundation of one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent memory. The investigation actually began long before investigators discovered the evidence now being discussed in court. When Celeste disappeared, family members and law enforcement searched for answers. Missing person posters circulated. Friends were interviewed. Investigators attempted to reconstruct her last known movements. At first, there were far more questions than answers. Where had she gone? Who had she been communicating with? Was she still alive? Those questions became increasingly urgent as time passed without any confirmed sightings. Eventually, investigators focused on David Burke. According to testimony presented during the preliminary hearing, detectives began examining his digital devices, financial records, travel history, and vehicle activity. Each search produced another small piece of information. Standing alone, none of those discoveries proved murder, but prosecutors argue that together they formed a consistent pattern. One of the earliest discoveries centered on Burke's Tesla. The vehicle would eventually become one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the investigation. According to testimony presented in court, investigators eventually discovered Celeste's remains inside the front trunk of that vehicle after it had been left parked for an extended period. Medical experts later testified that decomposition had advanced significantly, making parts of the forensic examination extremely challenging. Even so, they were still able to identify important evidence that prosecutors believe supports their case. The prosecution argues that the condition of the body actually revealed more than many people expected. Despite months of decomposition, forensic specialists documented injuries they believed occurred before death, as well as evidence suggesting extensive efforts to conceal the crime afterward. That distinction would become critically important. According to testimony from the medical examiner, investigators identified multiple penetrating injuries that were ultimately determined to be the cause of death. The manner of death was officially classified as homicide. The toxicology findings did not change that conclusion. While certain substances were detected during testing, the medical examiner testified that they did not appear to explain Celeste's death. Instead, prosecutors argued that the fatal injuries themselves tell the story. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence introduced during the hearing was not a wound. It was something much smaller, tiny blue plastic fragments. The medical examiner testified that these fragments were embedded within areas of the body examined during the autopsy. Prosecutors believe those fragments may match a blue plastic kiddie pool allegedly located inside Burke's garage. At this stage of the case, that connection remains part of the prosecution's theory and will likely be examined further if the case proceeds to trial. Still, investigators appear to view those fragments as a potentially important link between the alleged crime scene and the victim. The prosecution also introduced testimony regarding evidence of dismemberment. According to the medical examiner, several cut surfaces appeared clean and consistent with the use of a powered cutting tool. Again, these findings were presented as forensic observations rather than conclusions about exactly how every event unfolded. That distinction matters because prosecutors must still convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, meanwhile, has already begun challenging portions of the forensic testimony. Defense attorneys questioned whether the medical examiner could determine exactly when certain injuries occurred. They also explored whether some conclusions involve professional judgment rather than measurable scientific certainty. The medical examiner acknowledged certain limitations created by the condition of the remains, but maintained that the overall evidence supported the conclusion of homicide caused by multiple penetrating injuries. That exchange revealed what may become one of the central battles at trial. Not whether Celeste died, not whether investigators found her remains, but whether every forensic conclusion can withstand aggressive cross-examination. Even with those challenges, prosecutors appeared confident throughout the hearing. Instead of presenting isolated facts, they built a timeline piece by piece. Physical evidence, medical testimony, digital evidence, photographs, travel records, financial activity. Every category appeared designed to support the next. By the end of the first phase of testimony, the courtroom had only seen part of the evidence investigators say they collected. The most revealing material had not yet been discussed, because after examining the physical evidence, detectives turned to something that may prove even more powerful: the contents of David Burke's phone. Investigators say the device preserved years of conversations, photographs, travel plans, and digital records that could reveal not only the nature of the relationship, but also the timeline prosecutors believe ultimately led to Celeste's death. And according to testimony presented during the preliminary hearing, what detectives found inside that phone may become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. In part 2, we will examine the digital trail that prosecutors believe transformed this investigation from a missing person case into a murder prosecution. According to prosecutors, every major criminal investigation eventually reaches a turning point, a moment when physical evidence is no longer enough, a moment when investigators begin asking a different question. What did the suspect's own devices record? In this case, detectives believe that answer was sitting inside David Burke's phone. Unlike eyewitness testimony, digital evidence often preserves conversations exactly as they happened. Photos keep their timestamps. Messages record dates and times. Travel records can reveal where someone was. Search history can expose planning. Together, these pieces can create a timeline that is difficult to alter after the fact. During the preliminary hearing, prosecutors introduced testimony from an LAPD detective who reviewed the contents of Burke's phone. What investigators reportedly found was far more extensive than a handful of messages. According to testimony, the phone contained thousands of digital records documenting years of communication between Burke and Celeste Rivas Hernandez. The detective testified that the earliest known communication dated back to August 2022. According to prosecutors, Celeste was only 11 years old at that time. The communication continued until April 2025, only days before investigators believe she was killed. That timeline immediately became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments. Rather than describing a brief relationship, prosecutors allege the records document years of continuous contact. They argue that the conversations evolved over time and reflected increasing emotional involvement, travel planning, and discussions about a shared future. Jurors will eventually decide how much weight to give those communications. But at the preliminary hearing, prosecutors used them to establish what they believe was a long-running relationship hidden from public view. The detective testified that investigators recovered numerous photographs from the phone. Some allegedly showed Burke and Celeste together inside the Tesla. Others reportedly showed them traveling together. There were also screenshots from FaceTime calls and images prosecutors argued demonstrated the close nature of the relationship. Because many of those images involved a minor, they were not displayed publicly inside the courtroom. Certain photographs were withheld entirely because of their explicit nature. Instead, detectives described their contents during testimony while the court limited public exposure to protect the victim. But prosecutors did not rely on photographs alone. They also presented hundreds of text messages. According to testimony, those conversations covered nearly every aspect of the relationship. Daily communication, future plans, transportation, travel, pregnancy concerns, birth control, and discussions surrounding abortions. The messages, prosecutors argue, reveal not only what the two discussed, but also how frequently they communicated over several years. One series of conversations focused on pregnancy. According to testimony presented in court, prosecutors introduced messages discussing missed menstrual cycles, pregnancy tests, emergency contraception, and abortion appointments. Investigators believe these conversations occurred on multiple occasions. Those messages were not presented simply for their emotional impact. Instead, prosecutors appear to be using them to demonstrate the depth and duration of the alleged relationship. They also argue the conversations establish Burke's knowledge of Celeste's age and personal circumstances throughout that period. Another set of messages attracted particular attention. According to testimony, Burke and Celeste allegedly discussed her running away from home. Investigators testified that the conversations included details about transportation, what belongings to bring, and how they could continue seeing each other while avoiding detection. If accepted by a future jury, prosecutors believe these exchanges could help explain how the relationship continued despite ongoing efforts by family members to locate Celeste after she was reported missing. The prosecution also introduced evidence suggesting international travel plans. According to testimony, digital records indicated trips involving London and later travel connected to Texas. Investigators believe these records support their broader timeline by placing Burke and Celeste together during periods documented through additional evidence. Travel records, photographs, financial transactions, and messages all appear to reinforce one another rather than standing alone. That layered approach is common in complex criminal prosecutions. One piece of evidence confirms another. Another fills in missing gaps. Eventually, prosecutors argue a complete narrative begins to emerge. Perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of the digital evidence involved Burke's alleged awareness of the risks surrounding the relationship. According to testimony, prosecutors presented messages in which Burke referenced law enforcement concerns and acknowledged difficulties created by Celeste's age. Those statements may become important at trial, because prosecutors could argue they demonstrate knowledge that the relationship itself presented legal consequences. The defense, however, is expected to challenge both the interpretation and context of many of these conversations. Text messages rarely tell an entire story by themselves. Individual statements can sometimes appear very different when viewed alongside surrounding conversations. Defense attorneys will likely argue that investigators selected only portions supporting the prosecution's theory while excluding other contexts. Whether that argument succeeds remains to be seen. Another important question raised during the hearing involved motive. Prosecutors have not claimed that any single text message explains exactly why Celeste died. Instead, they appear to be building a broader picture. According to their theory, the relationship had become increasingly complicated over time. Pregnancy concerns, travel arrangements, family pressure, public exposure. Each issue added another layer of potential conflict. Whether those factors ultimately contributed to the events prosecutors describe will be one of the central questions for a future jury. Digital evidence, however, can only reveal so much. Phones preserve conversations. They record photographs. They capture movements. But they cannot explain every decision made behind closed doors. That is why prosecutors continue relying on physical evidence to support the digital timeline. Investigators argue that when the messages are viewed together with forensic findings, vehicle evidence, and witness testimony, the individual pieces begin fitting together in ways that strengthen the overall case. Still, the defense has already begun pushing back. Burke has pleaded not guilty. His attorneys have challenged portions of the forensic testimony and are expected to carefully examine every aspect of the digital evidence as the case moves forward. Questions about authenticity, interpretation, missing context, and investigative procedures could all become major issues before a jury. For now, however, prosecutors believe the phone provides something extremely valuable, not simply evidence, a chronological record. One that they argue follows the relationship from its earliest communications to only days before investigators believe Celeste's life came to a tragic end. In Part 3, we will examine the forensic evidence that prosecutors say connects the digital timeline to the physical crime scene, including the medical findings, the blue plastic fragments, and why investigators believe those tiny pieces of evidence may become some of the most important exhibits in the entire trial. The prosecution believes that every piece of physical evidence tells part of the story, not because any single clue proves what happened, but because each one supports another. When investigators combine the medical findings, the physical evidence recovered from the body, and the items allegedly connected to David Burke, they believed they were no longer looking at isolated discoveries. They were looking at a sequence. A sequence, they argue, reveals not only how Celeste Rivas Hernandez died, but also what happened afterward. The medical examiner's testimony became one of the most important moments of the preliminary hearing. Despite the advanced decomposition of the remains, forensic specialists testified that they were still able to identify significant injuries According to the medical examiner, multiple penetrating wounds were found on the body. One wound extended through the skin, soft tissue, the diaphragm, and into the liver. Another deep injury was identified on the opposite side of the torso. Based on those findings, the medical examiner concluded that the manner of death was homicide and that the cause of death was multiple penetrating injuries. That conclusion immediately became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Earlier in the investigation, there had been questions about whether decomposition might make it impossible to determine exactly how Celeste died. The medical examiner testified that although decomposition complicated many aspects of the examination, the fatal injuries remained identifiable. According to the testimony, those wounds were consistent with sharp force trauma. The toxicology results did not alter that conclusion. While certain substances were detected during laboratory testing, the medical examiner testified they did not appear to explain the cause of death. Instead, investigators believe the fatal injuries themselves explain what happened. But prosecutors were not finished. They then introduced evidence that may become one of the most unusual forensic details in the entire case: tiny blue plastic fragments. At first glance, they seemed insignificant, almost impossible to notice. Yet according to testimony presented during the hearing, those fragments were embedded within areas of Celeste's body during the autopsy. The prosecution believes those fragments may have originated from a blue plastic kiddie pool allegedly located inside Burke's garage. That theory has not yet been proven in court. However, prosecutors appear to believe the fragments provide an important physical connection between the body and what they allege was the primary crime scene. Forensic evidence often becomes most powerful when independent pieces begin supporting each other. A fragment alone proves very little. A fragment matching an object connected to a suspect can become much more significant. If laboratory testing ultimately confirms such a connection, prosecutors could argue that the evidence places Celeste inside that location during or after the attack. The defense, of course, is expected to challenge any such conclusion. They may question contamination, transfer mechanisms, laboratory analysis, or alternative explanations. Those questions will likely become major issues if the case proceeds to trial. Another major focus involved evidence of dismemberment. According to the medical examiner, several cut surfaces appeared unusually smooth and clean. Those characteristics, investigators testified, were consistent with the use of a powered cutting tool rather than natural decomposition or accidental damage. The examiner described multiple dismemberment sites involving the legs and portions of the hands. One particularly notable detail involved the removal of fingers that contained identifiable tattoos. According to testimony, one of those tattoos included letters that investigators believe linked directly to the relationship between Burke and Celeste. Prosecutors appear prepared to argue that removing those identifiable markings may have been an attempt to make identification more difficult. That remains part of the prosecution's theory and has not been established as fact before a jury. The condition of the remains also provided investigators with additional information. The medical examiner explained that decomposition had been affected by the environment in which the body was stored. Because the remains were located inside the front trunk of the Tesla, scavenging animals had limited access. That preservation allowed forensic specialists to recover evidence that might otherwise have been lost. Even so, the examination remained extraordinarily difficult. Temperature, humidity, insect activity, and the passage of time all complicated the investigation. Yet investigators testified that enough evidence survived to support their conclusions regarding the injuries and cause of death. One of the strongest moments for prosecutors came when they connected the medical findings with evidence recovered elsewhere in the investigation. Investigators had already collected digital records. Now they had physical injuries. They had possible trace evidence. They had photographs. And they had testimony describing how those individual pieces appeared to fit together. Rather than relying on one dramatic discovery, prosecutors have built their case by layering independent forms of evidence. That strategy is common in complex homicide prosecutions. Each category strengthens another. Physical evidence supports digital evidence. Digital evidence supports witness testimony. Medical findings reinforce both. However, the defense quickly began challenging portions of the forensic testimony. Defense attorneys questioned whether the medical examiner could determine exactly when every injury occurred. They asked whether decomposition limited certainty. They explored whether every conclusion could be supported with complete scientific precision. The medical examiner acknowledged certain limitations. For example, the exact sequence of post-mortem dismemberment could not always be determined because of the condition of the remains. Likewise, some injuries could not be evaluated with the same level of certainty as they might have been shortly after death. Nevertheless, the examiner maintained that the evidence supported the conclusion of homicide caused by multiple penetrating injuries. Those exchanges highlighted the strategy both sides appear ready to pursue. The prosecution wants jurors to see one consistent picture assembled from many different forms of evidence. The defense will likely attempt to separate those pieces, arguing that each contains uncertainty and that uncertainty creates reasonable doubt. Whether that approach succeeds will depend largely on how future jurors evaluate the scientific testimony. But one question still remains unanswered. If investigators believe they understand how Celeste died, why do they also believe there may be more people connected to what happened afterward? During and after the hearing, legal analysts noted that prosecutors have hinted the investigation may extend beyond a single individual. Questions remain about who may have known what happened, whether anyone helped conceal evidence, and whether additional charges could still emerge. Investigators have not publicly answered those questions. For now, they continue focusing on the evidence already presented in court. And according to prosecutors, that evidence has already established probable cause for the case to move forward. In Part 4, we will examine what happens next. We will analyze the defense strategy, the unanswered questions investigators are still pursuing, the possibility of additional charges, and why this case may be far from over. What happens after a preliminary hearing? For many people, it feels like the end of the story. In reality, it is only the beginning. The judge's role at this stage is not to determine guilt or innocence. Instead, the court decides whether prosecutors have presented enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial. In David Burke's case, prosecutors believe they have done exactly that. Over several days of testimony, they presented forensic evidence, digital records, photographs, witness statements, and expert opinions that they argue establish probable cause. Now the focus shifts, no longer to what investigators found, but to how both sides will explain that evidence to a future jury. If the case proceeds to trial, every piece of evidence introduced during the preliminary hearing will face a much higher level of scrutiny. Jurors, not a judge, will decide what evidence they believe, how reliable each witness appears, and whether prosecutors have proven every element of the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a far higher legal standard than probable cause, and it is where many criminal cases are ultimately won or lost. The prosecution's strategy appears increasingly clear. Rather than relying on one dramatic piece of evidence, they have built a layered case. First came the digital evidence, messages, photographs, travel records, communications spanning several years. Next came the forensic findings, the medical examiner's testimony, the injuries identified during the autopsy, the classification of homicide. Then investigators connected those findings with physical evidence, including the blue plastic fragments and the alleged links to Burke's garage. Each category of evidence supports another. Prosecutors will likely argue that the combined weight of those independent findings leaves little room for coincidence. The defense, however, faces a very different challenge. David Burke has pleaded not guilty. His attorneys are expected to question not only individual pieces of evidence, but also the conclusions investigators drew from them. Throughout the preliminary hearing, the defense focused heavily on uncertainty. They questioned the medical examiner about the effects of decomposition. They explored whether certain injuries could be interpreted differently. They asked whether some conclusions relied on professional judgment rather than precise scientific measurement. Those questions are likely only the beginning. At trial, defense attorneys may carefully examine every step of the investigation. How evidence was collected, how it was preserved, how laboratory testing was performed, whether every digital record can be authenticated, whether every witness remembered events accurately, whether alternative explanations remain possible. That approach is common in complex homicide cases. The defense does not necessarily need to prove another version of events. Instead, it must convince at least one juror that reasonable doubt exists. Whether that strategy succeeds will depend entirely on the evidence presented during trial. But there are still unanswered questions that investigators have not fully addressed in open court. One of the biggest involves whether anyone else knew what was happening. During interviews following the hearing, legal analysts suggested that investigators may still be examining whether other individuals possessed relevant information. According to a commentary presented after the hearing, prosecutors have not publicly revealed every aspect of their investigation. Some observers believe additional witnesses or evidence could emerge before trial. Those possibilities remain speculative. Investigators have not announced additional arrests or charges connected to the evidence presented during the hearing. Still, the investigation appears to remain active. Another question involves motive. The prosecution has introduced evidence describing the relationship between Burke and Celeste over several years. According to prosecutors, that evidence establishes the background of the case. However, motive itself is not an element prosecutors are legally required to prove. They must prove the charged crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. Even so, juries often want to understand why an alleged crime occurred. That means both sides will likely spend considerable time discussing the events leading up to Celeste's death. Those discussions could become some of the most closely watched moments of the trial. The case has also attracted national attention because of the age of the victim and the disturbing nature of the allegations. Many of the most graphic photographs shown during the preliminary hearing were never released publicly. Some evidence could not even be displayed inside the courtroom because it allegedly involved explicit material depicting a minor. Instead, investigators described portions of that evidence through testimony. As the case moves forward, the court will continue balancing transparency with the need to protect sensitive material. Another issue likely to receive significant attention is digital evidence. Modern homicide investigations increasingly rely on smartphones, cloud storage, GPS records, surveillance footage, financial transactions, and online communication. Unlike traditional witness testimony, digital evidence often creates a timeline that investigators can compare against physical evidence. In this case, prosecutors argue that the phone records, photographs, travel history, and forensic findings all reinforce one another. The defense will almost certainly challenge that interpretation. Future jurors will decide which explanation they find more convincing. For the Rivas Hernandez family, however, the legal process represents something very different. Throughout the preliminary hearing, family members attended many of the proceedings, despite the emotional testimony and graphic evidence presented in court. According to statements made outside the courtroom, they continue seeking answers while supporting the prosecution's efforts to pursue justice. Regardless of how the trial eventually ends, this case already demonstrates how modern investigations have changed. Years ago, detectives often depended primarily on eyewitnesses and physical evidence collected at crime scenes. Today, investigators also reconstruct digital lives. Phones, messages, cloud accounts, travel records, financial transactions. Together, those records can preserve years of history long after conversations have ended. In this investigation, prosecutors believe those digital records became just as important as the forensic evidence itself. Whether that evidence ultimately convinces a jury remains to be seen. That decision belongs only to the court. For now, David Burke remains presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has presented its version of events. The defense will have its opportunity to respond. And as this case moves toward trial, every piece of evidence introduced during the preliminary hearing will be examined once again under the highest legal standard. The questions that remain are no longer about what investigators found. They are about what 12 jurors will ultimately believe, because in the end, the evidence may tell a story. But only a jury can decide whether that story proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.